Opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Well, hello. Welcome to Spindle City Straight Talk. I'm Chip.
And I'm CJ.
And CJ, you have a kickoff?
Oh yeah, we've got to do a little clarification, so I think maybe we should take to that first. We received notification from a viewer, actually from Mr. Edward Kostar, that on May 20th, 2015 episode of Spindle City Straight Talk, at approximately the 28-minute mark, Edward Kostar was referenced to in regards to the hiring of Kevin Aguirre as a guidance counselor in the Fall River Public Schools. While I do not believe Mr. Kostar was a part of the political favors that were rendered to a former school committee member and former state representative, I do believe that this hiring of an unqualified individual is and has been rampant in city government and the school department. I apologize for any misrepresentation or misinformation whatsoever that may have been perceived. Mr. Kostar's clarification is contained verbatim right here. At the 28:30 mark, you mentioned my name in reference to K.A. Your remarks were not accurate. K.A. was given permission to do an internship by Superintendent Pavo. I supervised this internship at Durfee. I signed off when he completed this internship like I had done for other interns. This was common practice. An internship was required for secondary guidance certification. He became certified. I know this because he later applied for a job opening at Durfee. I looked over all the applications, and he was one of the 10 certified people who were interviewed for the job. He did not get one of these jobs after not being recommended by either Superintendent Pavo or Fisher. I treated K.A. like every other intern I ever supervised with no preferential treatment. In 2007, I retired. K.A. Aguirre was hired later by Meg Mayo Brown, or MMB as it's referenced here, as a guidance counselor at the Fonseca School. I have no knowledge of his licensure status at this time, but I can assure you he was a certified secondary guidance counselor when he was interviewed by me prior to my retirement. That's the truth. It was never the intent of Spindle City Straight Talk or I to misrepresent Mr. Kostar or his actions in any manner, and I apologize for any misunderstanding or misinformation. Sometimes we have to do a clarification or sometimes retractions. But we do know that this type of behavior by the city is to hire unqualified individuals and then get them certified after the fact. This is no reflection on Mr. Kostar, but it is a reflection on our city government.
Well, you know, I'm sure, yeah, and you know, I know Ed personally. He is a great guy, very conscientious, always was, and you know, unfortunately, we all at some point in time become victims of the ubiquitous umbrella that's cast upon everyone because you're guilty by association, and I don't think that, you know, I know CJ well enough to know I don't believe there's any malice in that, but the fact is that, you know, the way the system is, you have to work within the system you're in, and unless you're running the system, you really have no control. You know, Ed was doing his job. And as we have done in many cases, I didn't agree with a lot of the policies and decisions of the fire departments, even as a chief officer, but I was not the chief of the department. So unfortunately, this is one of the things, Ben. But it's hard sometimes because, you know, if you don't name names, they say you're being vague, and if you name Ed happened to be the person who did the training, and you know, ultimately, the blame always lies on where the buck stops. So the fact is that, you know, if somebody gets a job they shouldn't in the city, it's either the department head or ultimately the mayor or some other politician. And the problem is with this deal is sometimes if you name a name, you may be doing it and it's taken out of context. And I don't, you know, I've known CJ long enough to know that I don't believe he meant that in any in any way that to imply that Ed wasn't was in some way complicit with this, you know, because he's trained many people, and I will say that, you know, to my knowledge, and I know a lot of people in the school system, I have heard very few bad things about Eddie. He always did a great job. He's a very conscientious guy, and I consider him a friend. And bad for you, CJ. But no, I'm glad you cleared the air. Sometimes, as I said, it's difficult because in cases like that, sometimes when we begin to get on the mechanics of things, we begin to lose sight of the bottom line. Or in other words, an older adage, we don't see the forest for the tree. And that happens a lot in this city. You know, there was, we get bogged down, and sometimes it's an intentional tactic by administrations to get everybody infighting about minutia while, you know, they run away with the stoa. And I think that every once in a while, it's good to take a step back and look at the big picture and say, you know, what's our ultimate goal? And for me, the ultimate goal is better government, is to have a government that's responsive to the people of the community, not to the small segment of the privileged, you know, to have services for all the people. And this is why we remain active, and this is why, you know, yesterday at the City Council, I talked about using the fire and police protection as a pawn. They always say, look, if you don't pay more money, you know, you're going to begin to, you know, your safety is being jeopardized. Well, number one, they've already gutted the fire department to a point where it's virtually incapable of handling even a good single major fire without calling in everybody. So, I mean, I don't know if the point is irrelevant now, because, I mean, they've gutted the department, and now they're going to threaten us that if you don't, you know, if we don't get this collection fee, that, you know, we're going to lose fire and police again. And I produced a pawn that I got in 1997, and we were being used as a pawn then. But we're dealing with public safety. There are certain essential services that I feel a city is not only, it's morally obligated to provide. They should be priority services. That is education, fire, and police protection. Those services are must. They should be the last things cut, not the first. Yet in most communities, and especially this one, there's always the threat to get more money. Get more money, give us more money. But the problem is, every time we give them the money, ultimately they siphon it off and put it somewhere else, and it never comes back, and then they ask us for more money to replace the money they took. It's amazing and rather ironic, and I don't think coincidental, that the mayor is talking about 14 positions if he doesn't get this fee, a collection fee. And 2 years ago, they eliminated 14 city-funded positions. So isn't it coincidental it's the same amount of positions paid for by the taxpayer? Where did that money go? 2 years later, we've never received an answer. It's disappeared into that great void that we call the city vacuum cleaner, you know, because no matter how much money you give them, they spend it. You know, the city of Fall River has become like the federal government. The federal government works on an inverse principle. In a real business, it always gets me when people say we should run the city like a business. Yeah, well, if we ran the city like a business, we would have been bankrupt a long time ago and out of business, and somebody else would have opened up the store, because businesses don't run the way governments run, especially the federal government. The federal government, and I worked for the federal government, by the way. For when I first got out of the military, I worked for the federal government at Quonset Naval Air Station. And in the federal government, if you don't spend every single dime they give you in your budget gets cut. So regardless of whether they need something or not, they spend the money. Because if you spend all the money they give you more. And that's a great way to run a business. Just spend everything you have and get more money. But the problem is, that's what's created the issues we have in this country. The virtual elimination of the middle class. Because they're not really giving you anything. It's your money. It's tax dollars. And they never run out. Because every time they give you everything they've got, they go back and take more. And that's the feds. And even with all that, they have to print more. They print more money. They print their own. But the problem is, what the government and the people sitting in the city council and in the mayor's office don't seem to grasp is the only level of government that can deficit spend is the federal government. States and cities are not, they are prohibited from deficit spending. You can't print your own money. Maybe we can. Maybe we can begin to have Sutter bucks, and we can have Sam Sutter's picture on the buck, and we can use them as legal tender in the city of Fall River. When we can do that, and the city hall subsidizes that tender, maybe we can deficit spend. But until then, we don't. But you know what happens when you deficit spend? One day you wake up like we did last year and somebody says, there's a $16 million shortfall in the budget. And now there's another $6 million, $22 million short. How can you be $22 million short? I mean, come on. We've got an accountant, we've got a treasurer, we've got all these people. Nobody knows where the money is, nobody knows where anything is, and they don't care. Because what's the answer to the problem? Raise more money. Implement another fee. And, that's the problem. And I will stop my tirade because, that it really upsets me. But we have a lot more to talk about because the city council meeting last night turned into an epic council meeting. It was it was really a show, and you probably will not see it again on replay because it wasn't shown last night. And I'm sure that they've either given it over to the police department or they're going to edit it and eliminate the issues. But I'm done with my little tirade, so CJ, take it over.
Actually, I don't think they edited it. What happened was that they immediately blacked out the transmission, which is kind of normal for them. If an uproar occurs, decorum is lost, they kind of just...
Well, actually, I spoke to someone, CJ, I don't want to interrupt you, but I spoke to someone who said they actually showed it. They were watching it live.
Wow. Well, it's not being replayed, that's for sure.
And I think that's the reason it's not being replayed, because I think somebody ran a camera. Because I know someone who was sitting at home and saw the issues.
The debacle?
It was a debacle. But
and I'll tell you something. Ray Mitchell should have kept his mouth shut. Okay? While he was called out on that issue, and I'm not going to get into what that issue is because we're not going to rehash that. While he was called out on that issue, when that woman was going back to her seat, and he had to put, like every city councilor does, Ray's not the only one that does it. They got to have their 5 minutes of fame on that camera. Every time you turn around, they got to have the last word on camera. He opened his mouth, and that lit the fire underneath that explosive powder keg. And had he just been quiet, not made any comments, she would have sat down, she would have been quiet, and they would have moved on to the next speaker. But, like they say, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. I think right there, discretion needed to be exercised.
Well, I believe you're right. She was already out of the well. She was walking up. As a matter of fact, she was walking by me, and I was on a lower tier of the seating in the council, and she was already right alongside of me when Ray began to discuss it. And as I said, number one, it was an extremely sensitive subject. It's something he really shouldn't be discussing publicly now. These are allegations of criminal acts.
Correct.
Severe criminal acts. And unless you have the whole story, and obviously that's the problem, nobody has the whole story, except maybe the police department. So I'm not even sure if that should have been aired out in front of the council, but,
No.
you know, she went up there, she said what she had to say, she began to throw a few expletives around at the end, but she was leaving. And as you said, that, you know, there was a comment made, and it exploded into something that you know, was totally, you know, number one, you know, it's bad enough with some of the behavior. You know, there should be some sense of decorum, but you know, I mean, she was emotional. Obviously, the issue that was being discussed was an extremely emotional issue, and you can understand that. And sometimes you have to have, you know, enough common sense to say, look, let's leave this one alone. You know, she's on the edge. She's extremely emotional, and maybe we should not turn this into a discussion. But as you said, unfortunately, our council is more concerned about making a commentary and getting some, you know, on any issue they want to say anything. Unfortunately, they don't do much on anything. But it led to that total fiasco down there, and it's a shame. And you know, there are important issues in the city, you know, but again, mishandled, I believe, and there was nothing really that the president of the council could do, because it started, and it quickly turned into chaos.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, now there's one less bell to answer on the city council. I kept saying I want the privilege to remove the nameplate. Personally, I think Paul DaSilva overstepped it when he resigned. I think he should have resigned his committee chair and just sat there for the rest of the term like Brian Bigelow had done. But now you're giving Steve Long 5 months, okay, to have the mic, to have the press, and obviously he will run for election, because again, he's not running for re-election because he's never been elected. But again, now we have another lifelong, generational political hack in office. So if the people of Fall River think that they're going to get a change from what the Herald News calls a civic leader with civic interests in mind, I said, I made a comment to the Herald News. You're responsible for these endorsements. You always endorse the worst of the worst, the ones that do absolutely nothing for Fall River. I mean, and all you have to do is look back at Flanagan, and you see it. I don't know if you can remember, did the Herald News endorse Sam Sutter?
I'm not sure, to be fair. I won't. I'm not going to guess on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that.
Since we took I think we took a position of neutrality on
Right.
that election because of the recall, and they said, look, we accomplished our goal when the people who were involved in a recall were successful in getting a recall, and a lot of people wanted us to basically pick the next mayor, and I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to endorse or do anything. Let the public decide, and it's a difficult process, but we set a precedent that we wouldn't tolerate this, and I didn't believe it was in our best interest. So I'm not really sure, because I wasn't paying any attention to who got endorsed.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I want to find out, because it's amazing how Sam Sutter now wants to implement this $10 fee, and he's saying if you don't, I'm going to have to lay off firefighters, and right now they're talking about 1.5% with the $10 fee, which will be 1 or 2 firefighters, and even Chief Racine from the police department came on the air and said, we're going to look at cutting other parts of the budget before we have to lay off police officers. My problem is that if he doesn't get this fee, what happens? And Lou Pacheco said it very clearly. The I won't live in Fall River, not in those words, but I won't live in Fall River guy, who's the chief of staff, and he says, oh no, you can't earmark that money for public safety, because then it becomes a public safety tax, and that's illegal. So if you go for 2.5 override, because you say, oh, it's going to result in firefighters, it's a lie. Oh, we're going to pay the $10 fee because it's going to result in firefighters, it's a lie. And I'm calling it like I see it. I'm not calling it a mistruth. I'm not calling it a distraction. It's a lie. I mean, if you want to disagree with me, Chip, I want to hear it, but I think what the history has shown on 2.5 overrides and more fees.
Well, yeah, well, that's the major problem. It's only a short-term fix because politicians never saw money they couldn't divert and spend later. You know, they may keep their promise on the short term. Yeah, if he gets this collection fee, he may say, well, this year we're not going to lay off 14 firefighters and 30 police officers, which, by the way, is always using the most necessary services in the city as a pawn to try to get people, and they scare people. It's an intimidation tactic. But the problem is, then what they do is, as I said yesterday in my presentation, 2 years ago they laid off, they got rid of 14 firefighter positions on the Fall River Fire Department that were funded by the city. Nobody said anything. Why? Because they were negotiating contracts and people were getting pay raises, and everybody shut their mouth. And even the fire department didn't complain. They lost 14 firefighters whose salaries were being paid by the city and by the taxes, which that's what you're supposed to have. So you're not at the whim of grants. Nobody said a word. Nobody in the council. I went before the council and I made that point. We lost 14 firefighter positions, yet they created 2 captains and a lieutenant. More supervision for less personnel. So we lost 14 firefighters. Where did the tax money that paid for those 14 firefighters and their benefits go? Where did it go? 2 years later, we still don't have an answer because it goes into that black hole. And that's what happens every time they override 2.5. Every time they make a decision for you to make a sacrifice so they can keep fire and police, ultimately it goes away. Many years ago, we had a 300-man fire department. It got cut down to 250 or 255. We fluctuated between those two numbers. Why? Because the chief at the time said, it's cheaper to pay the overtime to fill in the holes by the shortage of 45 to 50 men than hire those 45 and 50 men because of the pay raises that were continuing to accrue over the years, and pay their benefits and pay their health care. And I actually was against that as the president of the union, which would seem, number one, not only, you're reducing the force, but the problem is, those are short-term fixes with people without any forethought. Because the fact is, yeah, you're right. Right now, it's cheaper to pay overtime. What happens 10 years down the road with all the pay raises? Well, what happened was they reduced the complement. When I got on the Fall River Fire Department, if you got 2 overtimes a year, it was a miracle. You maybe got 1. On 4th of July, when we used to have 10,000 fires on a 4th of July weekend, when they were burning down every city in the United States on 4th of July. It was a cultural phenomenon. So we'd get maybe 1 overtime. So then they cut it, and firefighters began to get a lot of overtime, make a lot of money. So everybody's happy. But I said, listen, 5, 6 years down the road, when salaries go up, and then cities refuse to increase the overtime budget, guess what? You're going to run out of overtime money. And guess what happened last year? They ran out of overtime money in 3 months. And what happened was that original excuse to cut the department became totally null and void. We couldn't supplement our manpower with overtime because the overtime budget did not grow commensurate with the pay raises. So they began to put less men on the piece, shut down pieces, and jeopardize public safety. What's the moral of that story? I don't care what they promise you. They never stop spending money and diverting money. If you don't privatize and you give him, I don't think we have any choice, he's going to put it in front of a board that's appointed. If he gets this, yeah, the firefighters will stay on for this year. Within a year or 2, they'll be gone. Because just like the 14 that left 2 years ago, when nobody's looking, they'll disappear. Or they'll come up with another reason. and money will get diverted. And the next thing they'll say is, if you don't give us more money, you're going to lose firefighters and police. But as I said at yesterday's council meeting, I want you to account for all the money you've already gotten. The 12.1 million, I'm going to say it again for everybody out there, $12.1 million over the last 3 years of the cost shift to the employees' health care plan. $12.1 million. The 14 firefighters that were eliminated 2 years ago, $1.4 million. That's $13.5 million that they've urinated into a hole. We're $6 million short. Isn't it ironic that we were $16 million short and ultimately they figured out how to get $13.5 million of that 16 out of the pockets of the city employees and out of public safety? And now they come back and say, we want more money for public safety. Well, the problem is the money never stays with public safety. It's their excuse and their vehicle to continue to pick your pocket. And like I said yesterday, you're not going to get another dime from me. I will privatize. I will do anything I can to give you as little money as possible because you people can't control spending. You never have controlled spending. And most of these departments have 50% supervisors and 50% workers. Our workforce and the services to this city and the services to the taxpayers have been reduced. We have less people servicing us. We have more supervisors and more high-paid cronies, and that's got to end. And in next November, let's clean house.
Well, you know, Chip, it's interesting because that $10 fee that the mayor's talking about, I talked to Kathy Ann last night, and she says, oh, well, we overestimated on the budget side so that when we don't meet those budgetary goals because there'll be less, we'll show a savings. But funny enough, I talked this morning before the show to a couple of the private waste haulers. The price wars have begun. Okay, as a matter of fact, I told them that I have a private waste hauler to one of the companies, and they said, what are you paying? And I told them. They said, I'll cut it. I'll knock $5 right off the top. I was like, what? So the price wars have begun. So guess what, Mr. Mayor? You're not getting your money. You're not getting it. Because with the price wars beginning now, which we told you would happen, this is what's going on. This is what's going on.
Yeah, you're right, because in business, that's what capitalism is. Prices are based because there's competition. But with the cities, there's no competition. And guess what? If he doesn't get the money from here, which he won't, they'll start talking about a 2.5 override. And what will be the excuse? We got to save police and fire.
Right.
And as I said yesterday, you know, I'm not going to vote for a 2.5 override. Take all the money. Take the 13.4, and now they've saved more money this year. Let's take the 17 million that you've saved by picking our pockets and put it into public safety. You know, and I'll say it simply. You know, take a screwdriver and turn it, because that's what I feel about you. Because that'll be the day. I'm not paying another dime. You know, I am not volunteering. If I can privatize. Anything I can privatize and take my money away from this city, because I'm not getting anything in return. This city has got highly overmanaged, and we get no services anymore, and we need to clean house.
Yeah, well, like I said, the price wars have begun. The net school spending budget was passed yesterday. The school committee had not even 1 day to review it. So again, blind government. Let's not worry about it. We're going to do what we want.
Wow, this show just flew.
Always does. Always does.
We got so much to talk about.
I know. We'll see you Friday. You have a great day.
Up the rebels.